You're listening to Forging Fluidity with Savannah Wishart and Griffin Coombs, where we humbly navigate the idea of primal purpose, exploring conversations around physical, psychological, and spiritual well-being on the quest for a truly conscious and meaningful human experience. The following conversation is all about being alone, more specifically the importance of carving out alone time, and some of the solo activities that work really well for us as individuals. We also touch on the difference between being alone and being lonely, not the same thing, and we explore the potential ancestral roots of the shame that so many of us experience when we're feeling disconnected from other people. If you feel like you have something to add or contribute to the discussion, we always invite our listeners to continue the conversation by reaching out to us on social media with your thoughts, reflections, and requests for future episodes. And please share and subscribe to the podcast while you're at it. Now enjoy the episode. Welcome back, everybody, and thanks for joining us once again on this week's episode of Forging Fluidity with myself, Griffin Coombs, and my co-host, Savannah Wishart.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back.
We were talking a little bit about, we were talking about a lot of things, as we usually do, and Savannah mentioned an article that she stumbled upon that kind of inspired the topic for this week's episode.
So this week we're going to talk about loneliness and the shame that can come with the feeling of loneliness. And we live in a world where we're constantly in motion and we're encouraged to be in so many different social settings. And as the world gets louder and there's more static created with social media and news and events and conflicts, there's just so much clutter in our lives, and it makes it really hard to carve out alone time. So when we do take time to carve out alone time, then it's even more valuable than I think ever before. And when we go into that space of solitude, then there's so much opportunity for us to tap into a greater sense of self-awareness and foster a relationship with ourselves without the outer influence of other people and expectations.
That's very true. And also, it can be very dangerous, or at least a slippery slope for a lot of people, especially people who aren't used to being alone, because it's very easy to kind of fall into a trap of being alone in a physical sense, literally being not around anybody else, but the things that you're choosing to do while alone can still get in the way of why you're actually trying to be alone, and might actually foster more feelings of loneliness, even though you're alone, than if you were with other people. And obviously it depends on what you're doing, and it depends on what you would be doing with those other people. But one of the things that you brought up when we were talking earlier was the difference between being alone and being lonely, and that they don't always go together. So I'm thinking that it's really important that if you're going to recognize that a lot of us don't spend enough time on our own, and you're going to try and build that habit into your life somehow, that you're going to do it intentionally. I think it's really important that we know why we want to be alone, and we know the types of things that we want to do that are regenerative and nourishing to us, so that we take full advantage of being alone and don't just kind of distract ourselves, like being alone, like spending time alone, but scrolling through social media or watching TV is not necessarily what we're talking about. Not judging it, not saying it's good or bad. It's just not the type of intentional alone time that I think we're trying to get at, and that a lot of people are missing in their lives. Because I think a lot of people, when they are alone, they do choose to do those kinds of things. So that's already there. Now, what types of things are missing? That's the question I'm kind of asking myself.
That's a great question. I'm glad that you brought up the focus on TV and social media as one thing that we can get pulled into in our alone time, because for me, when I think of like real rich alone time that is adding value to your life, you are cutting away sensory distractions. So especially audio and visual. So, whether it's TV, social media, or even music, I think music is great when used with intention and in small quantities. But for me, I notice when even with music, I start to use it as a distraction. So, it will pull me out of my thoughts, and I'll be able to distract myself with something orally, and it takes the attention out of my thoughts, which sometimes we want. So sometimes when we are focused on the time that we're spending in solitude, if we do feel ourselves falling into a negative judgment of loneliness rather than just simply being okay with being alone, then it does help to have an activity to focus our attention outside of ourselves. So then we can pull ourselves out of that negative thought loop and enjoy the alone time. So if it helps, it could be like training wheels. If we need music to kind of guide our activity in being alone, then we create that feeling of comfort with the alone time. And then over time, maybe we pull the music away, and then we get more comfortable with the thoughts in our head and bring awareness to it and mindfulness. And then we can shift those thoughts, or we can apply our focus to another activity. So I'm curious what activities you feel are the most enjoyable and potent in your own alone time, and where you find comfort and solitude, or even not even comfort maybe, but the most.
Kind of like benefit from being alone, whether it's comfortable or
Yeah.
not. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a good question. And I'm sure our listeners are interested in tangible things that they can try out. But I just want to caveat that with the idea that these are really personal. And I don't think that there are necessarily any, maybe a few alone activities that are universally beneficial. I think it's more of an experimentation around what lights you up and what really makes you feel like you're spending quality time with yourself and that it's regenerative. For me, the mornings are my sacred alone time. So in the mornings, I get up and I do some sort of breathing, like breath work. And I will do the way that that manifests is different. So sometimes I will do something that's kind of a routine breath work where or I'm following a guided breath work, or I'm counting breath cycles, practicing breath holds, which is a little more about the task at hand and a little less about sitting with myself, but it's still something that I really like to do by myself early in the morning. We mentioned in a previous episode that movement, in the morning when I'm doing just like some gentle mobility work or just working to move my body to get started for the day, and then drinking my coffee, and just being there with my thoughts. It's just a space to be, which sounds almost cliche at this point because everybody's talking about doing versus being, or we're too busy or whatever. But sometimes I feel like even if I'm doing something that's really regenerative and I'm by myself, I don't feel like I'm fully in my body, which we've also talked about before. So, an opportunity to have coffee, to be able to draw attention to the taste of the coffee, the feeling of the mug, how my body feels. The sun. I go up on my terrace if it's a sunny morning, so the kind of sunshine on my face and my body, and it's just a time to just be with myself. So I guess it's not so much what I'm doing, but it's more the time of day. It's kind of just starting my day without social media, without checking messages, and just intentionally doing these things that I do by myself that I know are good for my health and good for my mental space.
All beautiful practices.
I try to make them that way.
I can just imagine the sunny terrace in the morning.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, that's one of the many wonderful things about being in summer. So, what about yourself? What do you do to take time alone?
I think my favorite activity is hiking. I really just love spending the time in the nature and walking, focusing on one foot in front of the other, and using the feet almost as a metronome to complement the thoughts in a way. So for me, hiking also, it's so much about creating a strong mental foundation, especially if the hike is quite challenging. So a few days ago, I did a 10-mile hike along the coast of Portugal. So going from a beach that was near a town south toward the most western point of continental Europe. And I use the All Trails app because it's great and it shows you where the trails are. It gives you an idea of the landscape. And it said it was a hard hike, and I didn't really think much of it because I'm used to like giant mountains, and Portugal, in comparison to giant mountains, is fairly flat. But it was going up and down these really steep cliffs, and it was really hot as well. So I've learned that hiking is probably an autumn and spring activity in the south of Europe rather than a summer activity, which is great because I was worried about winter coming, and now I feel better because it's going to be super weather for hiking and rucking. But it was quite a challenging hike because of the heat and the slippery cliff faces. So whenever we're spending a lot of time alone and we're also doing hard things, it's so important for us to have awareness of our thoughts, because it's easy when we're pushing ourselves and challenging ourselves to be hard on ourselves and judge ourselves. And when we're tired or hungry or hot or thirsty, then we can get in those negative thought loops. So it was really important on this hike for me to be able to at least be aware of those thought loops, and to also be aware that right now my thought loops are not as positive as I would like them to be. So it was really about taking it one step at a time and reminding myself to be fully present in the moment, and not to have the distractions of music or social conversation to pull me out of the thoughts, but to just remind myself that I'm here, I'm fine. Like each step makes me stronger. And even if I can't fully stop the thought loops, it still is a process that I'm going through in my mind that is moving me in a new direction. And then in the end, I'll complete this 10-mile hike and I will be stronger than I was yesterday.
That's very insightful. I wonder if you think that being in nature specifically had anything to do with it. I was just listening to a podcast where they were talking about how being out in nature alone specifically, not just being alone, but the nature aspect specifically, works or helps to quiet mental chatter and negative self-talk, and just get you out of kind of these ruminating thoughts that might not always be super positive. And I forget the descriptive mechanism around it. Like, part of it is certainly seeking awe-inspiring experiences tends to help that stuff. So it just takes you out of your own problems, and it just makes our issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis seem less significant when we're struck by something that's a lot bigger than ourselves, like something grand in nature. But I think, to link this to the alone and lonely and all those other adjectives we're talking about, it must feel in nature, or at least I feel it when I'm alone in nature, that I'm not alone, but I'm not surrounded by what I'm normally surrounded by. I feel connected. I feel, as cheesy as it sounds, one with the world, or one with nature, because it's a way to subconsciously remind ourselves that we're not separate from the world, but we're part of the world, and we are animals that are made of the same stuff. Ultimately, if you want to get all, it's physics, right? I mean, we all came from stardust, quote unquote, as they say. So it's a way to to experience that, not just intellectually, because we can talk about how we all came from the same stuff and blah, 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 but to actually feel that can really only happen, I think, when you experience that time being surrounded and a part of the natural world. So I'm just curious about your hike, aside from how difficult it was and the fact that you were doing it alone, and how it just kind of recalibrated your sense of personal strength and perseverance and all of that stuff of just being out in nature itself helped you to kind of reset that negative self-talk at all. Or let me rephrase the question. Do you feel like if you had taken a just as difficult hike, but through like stairs and concrete in a city, it would have been the same experience?
Oh, absolutely not. The emphasis that you place on the time in nature, pulling your attention out of yourself and to the bigger picture of the world and where we are with our significance in the universe, I think is so important. Because I can also say that I could have probably gotten a similar benefit by just having a very easy walk through the nature. So I didn't need to go and do a really difficult hike to get the benefit either. And likewise, to your question, if I was in the middle of a city walking 10 miles, it would not have been the same at all. It would have had different benefits and been a different experience. But then part of being in the city also is our nervous system is constantly activated because we have to pay attention to everything that goes around us. So we're listening to hear if we're going to get hit by a car or if someone's walking by us, if we need to navigate around someone or something, because there's so much busyness constantly around us that we're always activated and we need to know what's going on. And when we're in a more natural setting in the wilderness somewhere, then our nervous system can relax. And I think that we're more open and receptive, and we can reach that parasympathetic state where we slow down, and that allows more thoughts to come up. If we're in that busy city environment, then again, our focus is on something else outside of ourselves. So to be in the nature, it invites us inward, even when we're just focused on the awe-inspiring landscapes. For me, I really feel it if I look at the stars. Like, I just
Hmm.
feel this shift in perspective of, wow, none of my problems really matter. Like, I don't ever need to pay off my student loans because the universe doesn't care about my student loans. So, if anyone's struggling with
This is
student
financial
loans, just
advice.
yeah, just go look at the stars and recalibrate your definition of money. But I get this perspective that nothing really matters, really, when I stare up at the stars, and then also that everything matters. So it's this kind of wholesome space being held by the world where it's all okay and it's all going to be okay as well.
That's beautiful. You just made me feel like everything's going to be okay. The interesting thing about doing this stuff alone is that I feel, this is from experience, doing too many things alone too much of the time can also not be good for us, because we are social creatures. We have evolved to seek connection and to thrive while connected with others. And it's been a long time since I recognized or started to recognize the benefit of doing things alone, all the stuff that we're kind of talking about. But I have definitely let myself fall in the trap of taking that too far in another direction. And it's not even just close relationships, because I have close relationships. It's more of a community type of thing where you have a group of people that it's not the public, it's not in mass, but it's not your super close circle, but it's It's having a kind of mid-sized community that you're free to interact with, and opportunities arise from, and connections might arise from, and it's a way to choose your level of engagement. And I am missing that where I'm living now. I mean, there's a big language barrier and cultural barrier that prevents a lot of that from happening. And I'm kind of distilling that as a source of loneliness, in spite of some of the close, intimate relationships that I have and I'm blessed with on a regular basis. So I think there's something to be said where, for example, you could get a huge connection benefit if another time you were to do that hike with somebody else. And I think, now that I'm thinking this through, I really think that the common denominator is the intentionality. Because if you do something alone with intention, it has these restorative benefits. And if you do something with someone else or a group of people intentionally, it can have also restorative benefits, some the same and some different than doing it by yourself. Whereas if you're doing things alone without intention and just habitually, mindlessly scrolling through social media, watching a series, whatever it is, you can kind of do those same things with groups of people. You know, they always say you can be surrounded by millions of people in a big city and feel lonelier than ever, lonelier than if you were by yourself. And
Hmm.
it doesn't really have to do with the people, it has to do with what you're doing. Like, if you're just on your phone scrolling, or if you're just kind of really, really stuck in your head, talking to yourself, probably negatively, it doesn't matter if you're doing that sitting by yourself, or if you're doing that surrounded by a bunch of strangers in a big city, or if you're doing that at a dinner party with people that you might know. If you're still in that space of just kind of going through the motions and not intentionally connecting with who you're with, whether that's yourself or the people you've chosen to be with, then that feeling of loneliness can pervade.
I'm glad that you brought it back to the community, because we do need to have that balance. And both of us have talked about our tendency to swing the pendulum between all or nothing. So it's easy to go into the lone wolf mentality and to just say, I'm just going to do this on my own, and then perhaps not prioritize the social connections in the community. And I'm curious what your ideal number is for that social community that you're missing, because you have that group of more intimate relationships, but what you're missing because of the cultural limitations, is it like a group of 20 people, is it a group of 100 people? Like, what does that look like to you?
I've never thought of it in terms of numbers so much as in terms of the types of things that I bond with people over. And so, for example, it's really easy to find people that will bond over eating and drinking, and that's really socially pervasive. And because those things are, well, eating is part of everyone's life or you'd be dead, but eating the same type of stuff, and then drinking alcohol is not a huge part of my life, or I try not to make it a huge part of my life. So that's not something that I seek to bond with people over, because it's not really aligned with how I want to live my day to day. And the ways that I do want to connect with people, such as through conversations like these, and physical movement, is that's where I really struggle. Because here, I'm a very intentional mover slash exerciser. I'm a movement and fitness coach, and I think that most of what's in the mainstream right now is complete bullshit and awful for the body. And so so for me to find somebody that I bond with over physical movement, which is how I really want to spend my time, that's really aligned with uh, with who I am right now. It First of all, there's a language barrier, so I wouldn't even be able to describe why I choose to move the way that I move and coach people the way that I coach people, because it's so complex, and you have to break down so many preconceived notions that it's even hard to explain to another native English speaker. And then there's the fact that here in Morocco, the fitness culture is even farther back in time than the state of Western Europe and America, where I have qualms with the mainstream fitness that is the most current in America. And now we're dealing with a language barrier and a fitness culture here where everybody's still doing bodybuilding and they're kind of stuck in the 1990s where the idea of things like CrossFit and cross training and things like that are just emerging here. So it's just there are so many layers to truly be able to connect with somebody through movement that it seems like an impossible task. And so I don't have a community. So it doesn't, if it were one other person, great. If it were 10 other people, great. I haven't thought in numbers. I've just thought in terms of what we're bonding over, if that makes any sense. But are you thinking of it differently? Do you have numbers in mind?
I don't have numbers in mind, but I've been reading about human connection and where we've come from as a species. And I think the ideal community that we're supposed to be a part of that adds value to our life without becoming too much is like 100 to 150 people within like a village or something. So
Hmm.
that's the ideal number. But I think that emphasizing the importance of connecting on like-minded values, I know is something that we've both struggled with. And it's about finding people who understand movement and nutrition in the same ways that we do, and being expats as well. We come from America, and the world sees America as this very unhealthy place. And so, at least for me, when I talk to people about the ideals of nutrition and like grass fed meat and slow food and different movement lifestyles, the functional fitness, the primal movement, then people say, oh, but Europe is so much better than America in this regard. But I think both you and I, we have participated in such a narrow, particular niche in the US of the primal lifestyle, the paleo diet, um, and those communities, that it's this totally separate thing than mainstream America. So for us, when we go into social situations and we are trying to explain this American background, it's not the general population that we are referring to. And so it's even more difficult to communicate, at least with the cultural bias of where we've come from as a country, then we're not able to kind of pull that along, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it just adds to the difficulty of the conversation because that's another barrier that you have to break down is their misconception of, well, it's not completely a misconception, but their misconception of us as part of their preconceived notion about Americans. And I'm sure this is what a lot of immigrants and expatriates experience in any country, no matter where you come from or where you're going. There are cultural preconceptions everywhere. And if you lie outside of that, it can be difficult, but it can also be an opportunity to connect with people. I have found it with my particular background in the place that I'm living right now. I found it to be more of a challenge than an opportunity, but you never know. But I like what, when you brought up what we are kind of designed to have, we're kind of designed to have a community of like 100 to 150 people. It reminded me that social connection is almost a form of currency as well because we've evolved to depend on one another, depend on our groups and our communities. And I think that that really ties into sometimes the feeling of shame around loneliness or the social stigma around doing things on your own. I think we live in a world where the value of social connection is hijacked by being hyperconnected globally. And so we have replaced real social connections where there's a reciprocal relationship that can actually be valuable and helpful to both in a practical, pragmatic way and on a kind of more emotional, psychological connection way. We've replaced those with just almost ticking boxes, like how many people I chat with superficially or how many likes or followers I have
How many
or
Facebook
whatever.
friends?
Exactly. And so that becomes, it becomes shameful in a sense, because that's now become the expectation, is how many superficial relationships do you have? And so then there are almost levels of stigma attached. It's like you either, the expectation is that you know a lot of people and you're kind of always socializing and you're always in big groups. This is a generalization. I know it's not everyone's expectation, but if you look at what's propagated in the media, it's big parties, it's big gatherings, it's lots of people, it's lots of friends, it's being in the spotlight, it's how do you spend your weekend, huge groups, clubs, bars, dancing, concerts, whatever. And that's all great. That's totally fine. But it's not the only way, and it needs to be balanced with other things. And so there's this kind of stigma around choosing to not be part of huge groups all the time. And then there's an even deeper stigma and some shame around the feeling of loneliness, because it's almost like I'm incapable of having friends, and being lonely
Mm-hmm.
is an indicator of that. And that's not true, but I can understand why it might feel that way and why you might feel shame around it in the culture that we live in right now. I think it's all rooted back to social connection being important and being a way that humans used to judge other humans, because if you can't connect with other people, you're not necessarily safe to be in our tribe. You're not necessarily going to contribute. But it's just been hijacked.
And if you can't connect properly with people, you might die if you're going back to the tribal eras.
Like it won't be part of their group.
Yeah, if you don't participate in the community and you're not liked or accepted, then you're going to be on your own. And then you're
Yeah.
going to lose your food source, your protection, everything else.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really clear to see the roots of this.
Yeah, and even the roots within our own lives psychologically. For me, this has been a journey that I've been working on. Feels like my whole life, but it's really been in the spotlight recently because I came from Sweden in a culture that felt very isolated, and I wanted to be in a more social culture. I felt that the social culture in Sweden is naturally introverted, and it's very difficult to facilitate connection in certain ways and social gatherings. And so, as an introvert, I felt that if I go to a more extroverted country, then it will be easier for me because then my alone time is naturally there. That's my foundation. So I don't have to force it. I can just naturally carve out my own space. And then the social gatherings, the culture, the people, they're there, and I can just walk into it. And it's not difficult to get that social kickback. Coming here, that has been true, that is the case. It's very easy to go into those social connections and environments. But what I found is also there's a lot of peer pressure with it, which I wasn't expecting. So it almost feels wrong to carve out my alone time. And when I first got here, I felt like I really needed to find an in person community and be really active in it. And the more that I tried, the more I felt that actually I'm quite okay with my alone time and my solitude. And I saw how much peer pressure and judgment there is around either choosing not to drink, choosing not to party, choosing to go to bed early. So, again, along the lines of the theme that we both seem to have of all or nothing, I went from, I need to dive into this community to now pulling back again and focusing on my alone time, focusing on the online business, and also focusing on a handful of friendships that I really want to have. So while we do have this ideal tribal number of 100 to 150 people in our community, at the same time, if we really want these really close connections, something I read was that you really only need 3 to 5 people who light up when you walk into a room. So to really fully infuse your intention into just less than a handful of people who really have your back.
That's very wise advice. And I think anybody listening who has had those types of relationships will probably agree that they are the most important, the close circle. Light up when you walk in a room. I love that. Those people are just absolutely invaluable. So if you're going to focus on connection, those take priority. Wrapping up, the kind of lessons that I think we can give to our listeners, or not lessons, but maybe advice that we can give to our listeners stemming from this episode, at least my takeaways, and then I'll invite you to add or edit or give your own version. But I'm taking it back to intentionality, and that we need time alone in a way that prevents us from depending on time with other people and other distractions all the time. And so the amount of alone time that we need is going to be different. What we do while we're alone is going to be different, all depending on who you are. But there needs to be some time independent of other people and distractions, that where we can be with ourselves. And if we find that really difficult, I don't think it's something to shy away from. I think it's something to step into and build a relationship with. I would say the same thing goes for spending time with other people, but again, with intention, quality time with other people, not being physically with other people, but feeling alone, but actually choosing who you're going to spend time with, what you're going to do, and doing it because it fills you up and it fosters the connection between you and those people, rather than just physically putting you in the same space as other people but not doing much else. So from my perspective, the glue that links all of it together is intention, that we need both connection, meaningful connection, and we need time with ourselves, as long as we're doing that purposefully and not in a distracted way. And maybe a piece of concrete advice might be that find where your baseline is. So my baseline is to do a lot of things on my own, and then work on adding in the other side that is not your baseline in an intentional way. So for me, it would be, I don't need to think about spending more alone time because I have my routines where I'm intentionally with myself. I need to think more about how do I add in intentional community when I can, but others may be the opposite. So for what it's worth, there are my takeaways. And Savannah, I invite you to share yours.
Thank you for the invitation, but I think you covered all the takeaways really that were on my mind. So just to add,
Not
just
that
to
you
add
need
a
an
little.
invitation. You are the co-host of the show, but
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. But just to add some different vocabulary to it as well, it is about the intention. And so for me, to invite you as the listener to go into asking why. Like, why am I choosing to do this right now? Am I doing it for the sake of something to do or someone to spend time with, or am I doing it with a deeper purpose behind it and beneath it? And I love that you highlighted looking at what the foundation is for any of us. If we default to alone time, then maybe we need to be more active in creating the social connections that really nurture us, and vice versa. If we are always out every night and spending time surrounded by people, then it is more about creating that conscious space for solitude. And while we are wrapping this up, I also want to highlight that even if we are spending a lot of time alone, if that is our default and we feel like something is still missing and it's not necessarily related to social connection, to get curious about what we're doing with that alone time, because it might not be social media or TV that is obviously pulling our attention away from that alone time, but we still have a tendency to make ourselves really busy. So if we are working, or if we're, especially if we're working from home still, or we're location independent, or if we're always creating or working on a project, then it's not even just about being alone, but creating a space to literally do nothing, which might look like doing a 10-minute guided meditation and to sit still and to then train yourself to see alone time and nothingness as something that's productive and restorative, because we can convince ourselves that mobility and training and everything will rejuvenate us and that will be productive in our body and our mind, but maybe we really need to just erase everything and have a blank slate for 5 to 20 minutes.
Totally agree. And that's just going to depend on who you are, what your struggles are, but we're always reflecting. There's always room for reflection. So if you are doing quote unquote all the right things on the surface level and something still feels missing, I totally agree, Savannah, that the more curious we get, the deeper that we go, the more insight we have about ourselves. And that's just going to look different. And one of the ways that differences can manifest is the way that you spend time alone. So it's been a pleasure, as always, having this conversation. Thank you to all of you who are listening from wherever you are in the world. And we're looking forward to hearing from you, your reflections on this episode or any other episode, what you might like to hear about in future episodes, or just a hello and sharing a little bit about your story and your journey. You can find me on Instagram at moves with Coombs, underscores in between all of them. You can find Savannah at Primal Revolutions.
We're looking forward to seeing you next time, and we encourage you until then to use curiosity as your compass to navigate the world with primal purpose in whatever way that feels good for you.